Welcome to this week's episode of Between Past and Future. I'm Rajdeep with my host Ethan Quinones.
How's it going, guys?
Okay, so we got three stories. We got an update on we have an update with the situation in Turkey and the Hagia Sophia. We're gonna talk about Proposition 16 here in California, and Ethan's got a story for us.
All right. Yeah. Do you want to start with the is it Hagia Sophia or Hagia Sophia? I've always said it the second way, but I have no clue what the actual pronunciation is.
I'm not exactly clear, but I've heard more often Hagia or Hagia Sophia. The second part's definitely
Hagia
Sophia.
Sophia or Hagia Sophia.
I just pulled up. You ever see that YouTube page? Emma saying,
I've seen things like that. I don't know if it's the same specific one. I heard it a
yeah,
little bit over the speakers.
it might be somebody. There's a bunch of copycats. I'm actually not sure if this is the original one, but I've seen this format and like black text off white background. They say with either with a like soft G, like, or I think the hard G sound. Well, we can just stick with that one. All right, so let's start with the Hagia Sophia story, and then I'll share my little news bit.
Okay, so if you guys remember, about a month ago now, month and a half, President of Turkey, Erdogan, he declared that the Hagia Sophia is no longer going to just be a museum, a religious museum, because it housed before the Turkish Revolution in the early 20th century, it was a mosque, and then it had been a mosque since about 1453, I believe, when the Ottomans conquered the Byzantine Empire. And before then, it had been a Christian church, and it had been that for, I think, a good like 1,000 years or something like that. It's a really old building. But anyway, about a month ago, Erdogan said it's now going to be used as a mosque again on the weekends, particularly for Friday, which is the Muslim holy day or Sabbath. And during the week, it's still a museum, but um, for Friday, it is Friday through Saturday, Sunday maybe, it's now a mosque again. And the first sermon was delivered on 2-3 weeks ago, I think, at this point, by a by Imam Ali Erbas, who is the president of the Directorate of Religious Affairs, which is a specific department in the Turkish government. It is an official government branch which executes the works concerning the beliefs, worship, and ethics of Islam, enlighten the public about their religion, and administer the sacred worshiping places. It's called the Diyanet in Turkish, and they draft weekly sermons that are delivered at the nation's 85,000 mosques and more than 2,000 mosques abroad that function under its directorate. It sets curriculum for like Quranic education and stuff like that. So, and apparently, all of Turkey's imams are technically considered civil servants. So the person who runs this organization is Imam Ali Erbas, and he gave the first sermon on a Friday. And while he delivered the sermon, he held a sword in his hand, the sword of conquest. And he talks about a bunch of stuff. The whole transcript can be found in English online in various places. We'll stick a link up on the show notes. And one thing that I want to sort of signal out here is this discussion of conquest. So this is from the sermon. Ali Erbas says, Salat and salam be to Muhammad, who gave the good news about the conquest, saying, one day Constantinople will be conquered. Great is the commander who will conquer it, and great are his soldiers. I'm guessing this is from the hadiths, which are the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad. And then Erbas continues, and he defines conquest for us. Conquest does not mean attacking, but rendering prosperous. It means building rather than destroying. To our martyrs and veterans who have made it our homeland and entrusted it to us, and all of the sultans of the hearts who have remolded our geography with faith. So this is a pretty big deal. The Other areas of the Middle East, the Muslim world, got very excited about this. There is direct praise from Hamas, the Palestinian Islamist group, Iran, Abbas Mossavi, a spokesman for the Iranian Foreign Ministry, proclaimed that they were happy for the opening of the Hagia Sophia for worship, which was accepted with satisfaction by the people of Turkey and Muslims. We also felt joy, referring to Iran. And in Pakistan, in their largest state of Punjab, the Speaker of the State Assembly, Chaudhry Pervez Elahi, called the Turkish president courageous. He said, "We hail President Recep Tayyip Erdogan for his courageous decision on the status of the Hagia Sophia Mosque. It is not only in accordance with the wishes of the people of Turkey, but the entire world." So, yeah, this is a really big symbolic and emotional event in the Muslim world. And apparently, I need to do more digging on this to get a double verification, but the Jerusalem Post reports that in the Arabic version of the speech, as it was translated by President Erdogan in relationship to the Hagia Sophia, he vowed to liberate the mosque Al-Aqsa, which is in Jerusalem. And the Al-Aqsa Mosque is a very important mosque for Muslims. It has to do with the life of Muhammad and sort of hagiography around him. There's a night where he's sleeping, I believe, in Medina, right before he flees to Mecca. And the way the story goes is Muhammad is transported into sort of the heavens, and he has an interaction with some of the elder prophets, and then he comes down into Jerusalem at the site which is the Al-Aqsa Mosque. What exactly Erdogan means by liberating that mosque is totally up for speculation. And yeah. And then one last point is Egypt distanced themselves from this, whereas Iran and certain aspects in Pakistan were praising Erdogan. Egypt sort of denounced the Hagia Sophia move, and they are actually building up their historical Christian holy sites. Egypt is a majority Muslim country, but they're going to try and capture the market on Christian religious tourism that looks like it's probably going to be ending soon in Turkey. Turkey made a lot of money from Christian tourists, as well as some Jewish tourism, I believe, and Muslim. But now I think Egypt's going to try and pick up that market share in relationship to religious tourism.
So I don't know that much about this whole thing. Is it at all common to have a sword while you're giving a sermon in a mosque? Is that like a common rhetorical device, or I guess it wouldn't be a rhetorical device, but is that a common thing somebody to do, or is that an extreme thing to happen?
I don't think it's necessarily extreme. Urbas says that reading sermons with a sword is a common practice in our history and tradition. And when Istanbul was conquered and the first Friday sermon in the Hagia Sophia was read with a sword and continued for 481 years. So it seems like this was the way of doing things in the mosque before Islamic activity was ceased there. So he is acting in line with the tradition that had existed there before. And he makes another point about holding. It really depends on what hand you're holding the sword in. So he says if you're holding your sword in the right hand, that means that it is like an Islam at war, so to speak. But he says in the left hand it is a sword of peace, and he does hold the sword in his left hand, and he's not like holding it up in the air. It's sheathed, and he's kind of like got it in front of him, kind of like a cane.
I was picturing like someone literally like waving a scimitar around while they're talking.
No. Sorry. And this kind of imagery, I don't know too much about it in relationship to Islam. It seems like there's some sort of tradition of this. using the sword inside the church. And I mean, in Gurdwaras, you've got swords all the time. They're set up in front of um, our holy scripture, the Guru Granth Sahib. So part of the ritual you do when you sort of walk into a Sikh temple is you bow and it's called Mathadek. You put your forehead on, you kind of do like a little bow all the way to the ground, put your forehead on the ground. And then there's the book, and right in front of the book are some swords and stuff like that. So, people have swords in religious places all the time. But it is, I guess, it is still a resting imagery. And that's partly the point of it.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like, this guy was just looking for something to lean on and happened to pick up a sword. But at the same time, if there is a history of this being used in a non super aggressive way, it might just be sort of, especially if there's a history of when it was first, you said it was when it was first converted 400 years ago, 500 years ago to a mosque. But this to me seems more than a call to violence. It seems like a call to return to tradition or a previous way of doing things. And I think that seems to be a bit of a trend in certain countries, even within conservatives in America, but the strong desire to return to a previous time when things were better.
Yeah. And I don't necessarily disagree with that kind of thinking.
Yeah, I know you don't. I don't know, man. The past was pretty lame. People are just getting fucking beheaded all the time. You could
Yeah,
get
there was a lot
kicked
of
in the head
violence
by a
back
horse.
then. But yeah, that's the update on the Hagia Sophia.
All right, so the story I have today is about the alleged epidemic of murders against transgender people. And this is a meme that's popped up over and over again for at least the past 5 years. It may have been popping up before that, I'm not exactly sure. But the idea is basically that transgender people are killed at a shockingly high rate. And that it's getting worse, that this is something that we need to deal with before it spirals out of control. And what made me skeptical about this at first was what you hear people say there were 19 transgender murders, and already in August there were 22 transgender murders this year. Well, how many transgender people are there in America? If there's only 10,000 and 20 people are being murdered every year, 20, 30 people, that would be a big problem. If the number's consistently going up, so it started at 0, and then it went up 2 murders every year until it reaches 30, and it continues to increase by 2 murders, that would seem to suggest something. When you look at the numbers, even those put out by the Human Rights Council, the Human Rights Campaign, which is one of the leading LGBTQ lobby groups, the numbers fluctuate. It went up, it went down, it goes up, and they all stay within 4 or 5 actual murders of each other. Then the other problem is if you look at the number of transgender people in the country, the estimates range from 0.6% to 3% of the population, essentially somewhere between 600,000 and 1.4 million people. For 20 to 30 people to be murdered out of that many people is not unusual in the United States. And immediately people attack you and say, oh, you don't care about trans people, blah, blah. It doesn't matter, one murder is too much. Well, of course one murder is too much, but you wouldn't say there's an epidemic of violence committed by illegal immigrants because one illegal immigrant kills someone, or even 2 or 3 or 4. You actually need to understand how many quote unquote illegal immigrants are in the country and how many murders were the year before, the year after, preferably over the past 10 years to determine whether or not illegal immigrants are part of an epidemic of murders. And Donald Trump and the Republicans use the very same tactics as it seems people are using in this, just simply stating a number and expecting people to be outraged. Did you know that 30 trans people were murdered last year? Okay, that's horrible. But how bad is it? You'd have to understand how many trans people there are in the country and what the murder rate is. So there's an article in Quillette by Wilfred Riley where he compares various stats from the FBI, from the Human Rights Campaign's own published statistics, and from general census numbers. So the population of the U.S. is about 327 million. If you assume that the estimate is on the low end, and it's 0.6% of the population, and there's 29 murders. Do all the math out. Divide the number of trans people by the number of murders times 100,000 to get the murder rate. You actually find out the murder rate's about 1.48 per 100,000 people. and that's about 1/4 of the current murder rate for all people. There were 16,000 homicides in 2018 and 17,000 in 2017. And so that means that trans people are actually less likely to be a victim of murder. If you were to double the amount of murders, actually, if you were to quadruple the amount of murders of trans people, let's say only 1/4 of them are being documented, which seems unlikely due to the amount of attention that various groups all across the country, they're trying very hard to document these numbers. So it seems unlikely that they're missing 75% of them. Even if it was 4 times worse, it would still be in line with the general population. And that doesn't even factor in other minority groups besides trans people. The murder rate for black men in America is 18 per 100,000, which is 18 times, about not 18, it's about 9.5 times what the estimate for the transgender murder rate is. So that means a black man is 9 times more likely to be murdered by a trans person. And these numbers have also stayed largely the same within the black community as well. The overall numbers of murders tend to go down overall. So it's not, when you see the murder rate go down, it may not be equal across the board, but it's uncommon to see that murder rates dropped only for white men or only for black men or something like that. There seems to be larger trends at play. Another point this guy brings up in his article is that the murder rate for all males is 6.6 per 100,000. So men are more likely to be murdered. Any man is more likely to be murdered than a trans woman is, or trans men. I think that the number is actually just for trans people of any identifying lean. So trans men, trans women. I'm not sure if non-binary people are included in this, but I think that it's a fairly wide net. And another thing that's very, very interesting when you look at these numbers is that he writes, in addition to not being hate crimes, the majority of transgender murders are intraracial. According to Green, Green is another author who's working with the same data. 34 of the 37 identified murders of black trans people killed between 2015 and 2019 are themselves black. The same holds true for the killers of white trans people. And interestingly enough, even among Hispanic people who can be of any race and can identify as members of more than one ethnic group, at least 4 of the 8 individuals responsible for recent fatal attacks on Hispanic trans persons were themselves explicitly identified as Hispanic and Latino. Another factor to consider, out of 118 cases of anti-trans homicide compiled by the Human Rights Campaign, only 4 of those perpetrators were clearly motivated by anti-trans animus. In contrast, 37 murders were due to domestic violence and 24 involved sex workers and were largely a result of the dangerous working conditions associated with illegal sex work. A few others were essentially random acts of violence. One of the victims in Green's data set was Jordan Kofer, the transgender murder murdered by the Dayton shooter. So this was not someone going out to shoot trans people. They were a victim of senseless violence. And also, none of these people are not saying that this is good or supporting it. They're very against it. And part of the way that you deal with something like this is really understanding the problem. Simply sitting around and shrieking and saying, there's an epidemic, that doesn't solve anything. All it turns into is endlessly sharing Instagram memes that do nothing because this isn't the actual problem. There's other statistics, I haven't done too much research into this, that claim there's an abnormally low life expectancy for trans people. And various other issues, drug addiction, being forced to be a prostitute, sex workers, whatever. These are actual problems you could focus on. And instead you have the might of the Human Rights Campaign going behind what's essentially propaganda and fake news. There is not an epidemic of trans murders in this country. If anything, trans people are becoming more and more accepted in society, and the number of murders may fluctuate and seem to go up, but compared to the population, you are safer in walking down the street than you being a trans woman than you are a black man in terms of being murdered. If evidence is fairly clear, but if you bring this up to people, they get very, very angry. And that's, I think, equally alarming, is that when you tell people, hey, there actually isn't a murder epidemic going on, it's not as bad as you think, they get pissed. Why? I'm not exactly sure. It seems it has something to do with the idea that anybody who doesn't exaggerate the danger that various minority groups face is what's the word I'm looking for? They're if you don't exaggerate it, you're excusing it somehow. So these people who share these stories, they're trying to do something good. They're trying to help trans people, but their method of doing it is simply to be hysterical, and this hystericism isn't really about anything real. There's no epidemic going on. It's just not true.
See, that's the response that you're describing about people getting mad when you tell them this type of thing. That's really sad. And it's sad because what you're telling them is good news. They should be happy about these statistics. I mean, put out by the Human Rights Campaign, prominent LGBTQ plus lobbying group, right? So these are the people doing the social work, they're doing the political work around this issue, and they've done an investigation. And you're always going to have to do more investigation, but they've done this investigation and they came back with really good news. But the response to really good news is anger and maybe even something like a hateful backlash.
Well, so I shared this this idea on a Facebook or an Instagram page that they shared. It's a meme page that usually before the George Floyd uprising, etc. 80 plus days of protests, they just shared memes, funny memes. Oftentimes they were quote unquote offensive memes, but they were offensive in a certain way. So this person was blocked from Instagram a couple times, but it's a African American woman, black woman, who is posting memes that sometimes make fun of white people or sometimes very sexually explicit, etc. So it's not some sort of alt-right troll. It's the exact opposite. But once this George Floyd thing posted, they started just inundating their page with memes about all sorts of social justice things, when previously it had nothing to do with it. Nothing to do with, actually, it was kind of the opposite. It kind of made fun of those type of people. So today they shared a meme that said, "Arm trans women." And there's a picture of like a little anime girl holding a machine gun. And it says, "Not a meme, but I just wanted to say how disappointed I am every day because of the lack of respect and love for trans women. All you N-words who was rallying and rioting for Black lives, I hope you show up for Black trans women too. We are 8 months in 2020, and more trans women have been murdered in the whole of 2000 than in the whole of 2019 that we know of, etc., etc." So it keeps going on about how there's an epidemic. I commented basically that if you look at the numbers, there may be as many as 2 million trans people, and even if it's as small as 600,000, the murder rate seems pretty low. The meme page responded, "This isn't the hill you want to die on." No response, just empty planet. No, this just doesn't make any sense, right? They got 193 likes for saying this isn't the hill you want to die on. Then the responses started to get angrier very quickly. Some of them I can't see anymore because they just blocked me.
Interesting. So you send this one comment giving good news and you end up being blocked.
Yeah, so but not only that, they'll say something like, "Screw you, you're so hateful, I hate you," and then block you. One person said, "It's not about how many are alive, it's about how many have died. Let's be clear that their deaths are often much more violent than other murders." So that doesn't really address anything I said. Then somebody says, "Ethan, shut the fuck up." Okay. Someone says, "What the hell are you talking about?"
So that's okay.
Somebody says, "There's one I was looking for. I can't see it anymore. There's one I was looking at specifically that said, 'What is wrong with you? Why are you so hateful? You're an incel.'" Just very quickly, just random hatred for someone who's saying, it doesn't actually seem. This was also just an experiment. I knew no one was going to listen to this and say, "Oh, thanks for the good news." But I was just curious to see if it would happen, and it did. As soon as you disagree with this claim that transgender people are murdered at an unusually high rate, people do get mean and aggressive and start insulting you, and especially right away start calling you an incel, which is an odd sort of path to go down.
Yeah, that is odd. I want to take it back a little bit to the beginning of your report, where you talked about how the Trump administration uses a similar tactic when they are talking about the number of murders committed by illegal immigrants. And I think the issue here is something like people have begun reacting to facts without looking at the context. And so there's been a lot of sort of hurraying or like yelling about the importance of facts in the last 4 years, particularly. But you can have all these facts, but if you don't have a context to put them in, then it's like, what are you supposed to do with it? And that's what's so interesting about the number of trans deaths or the number of murders committed by illegal aliens, is that these are figures without context, because it's people getting upset over murders without actually looking at how murder is actually happening in the United States as a whole.
And also, I think what I've seen too, not specifically related to this, but people don't understand the scale. People don't have a firm, even casual understanding of the number of people who die or are killed in this country. So if you ask someone how many people are killed by the police every year, oftentimes they'll just say too many. They can't
Right.
actually give you a figure. If you ask people how many murders are there every year in the United States, how many drug overdoses are there? I'm not saying everyone should have these numbers at their fingertips, but if you're talking about issues like this, you should have basically some general awareness.
Right. A similar situation is also on the gun control argument, where people talking about wanting to ban assault weapons rather than handguns. You'll hear a lot of people on the left who don't really know very much about guns saying that we should get rid of assault weapons and keep handguns, right? Like that, they seem like that would be a fair compromise. But most of the murders are done by or perpetrated by people using handguns. And in addition to that, most of the deaths in our country related to handguns, I think it's over 60%, are suicides. So it's like most of the handguns in the country are people killing themselves rather than other people. But then on top of that, handguns are still responsible for more murders than assault weapons are. But assault weapons are the guns that people on the left typically want to ban.
Yeah, I think there's definitely, well, I think part of the problem too is that assault rifle is an ambiguous term. It could mean you could take a 22 rifle and modify it to be an assault rifle. If you add a bump stock and extra magazine, you've essentially created an assault rifle with a very small caliber bullet. The danger in these weapons that people get mad about is their ability to rapidly fire immense amounts of ammunition very quickly, and oftentimes accurately, and oftentimes higher rounds.
I think that's the sensible sort of critique of the gun. I think for a lot of people, it just comes down to
it looks scary.
Exactly.
That's literally, if you show like this, if you show people a whole table of guns and say, which ones should we ban to keep the country safer?
Yeah, I think Steve Crowder did that.
Yeah, I would definitely. I mean, personally, I would say I don't see any reason why people should have bump stocks. I think that you should limit the caliber and the firing rate of various guns. But I know that an AR-15 is no much more dangerous than a, I don't know, like what are those small P19, whatever they're, those small they're pistols that you can basically shoot like 15 rounds in a minute. And if you're accurate, you could do a lot of damage with that. Where a regular AR-15 that you take off the shelf at Dick's or Walmart, that's not the same thing that you see people use in school shootings oftentimes. Those are modified or have extended magazines or have semi-automatic aspects to them. I don't think a regular AR-15 is semi-automatic, is it?
I'm not sure. I'm not familiar with that. I only own one long rifle, so.
Yeah, but I mean, in large part, it's fairly similar. People are getting outraged and they don't understand the facts. And sometimes these are things that are definitely like of course it's horrible that people are being murdered, especially if people are being murdered for their identity, or people who are prostitutes are being murdered when they're just trying to earn a living. But when you just get mad about it and scream and make up facts, that doesn't help anyone. It actually makes it more difficult to talk about the real problems. Somebody commented, which I also can't see now, which is, if I'm really trying to learn, I should be able to see all these comments that people were trying to say, right? but somebody commented something along the lines of, well, the average life expectancy for trans people is only 35, so you should go to hell, something like that. And if that's true, I didn't do any research, so I have no idea. If that's true, and the statistics are saying that murders are not causing this, then we should really look deeply at what is causing this. And when people, especially the people who are supposed to be the activists, who are going around college campuses and just repeating this. I've seen people repeat this same figure and this same hysterical, made-up nonsense fact for 5 years, and they work at various charitable organizations, from GLAAD to homeless charity, whatever. And so these are people who are supposed to be on the front lines of helping, and they're just making stuff up or just repeating stuff that isn't true. Here's another example that isn't entirely related, but it's partially related. There was I'm sure there are going to be more details that come out, but the story goes that there's a trans woman on the side of the road minding her own business, and she gets mugged, and a group of men are standing there and don't do anything to help her and actually kind of make fun of her. It's hard to tell from the video. I didn't watch it all. I didn't listen to all the audio, but it seems like that's generally true. It seems like this person was robbed, and the bystanders didn't do anything and were kind of mocking them. Again, when you look at this person's Instagram, the trans woman who was murdered, I don't know that a man on the street would look at her and say, look at that trans person. I don't like them. I think that they largely would look like whatever anyone's idea of a woman is. You understand what I mean? It doesn't look like
They're
they can
passing.
it doesn't look like they could be easily identified and discriminated against based on how they look. Who knows, though? It could have been a voice thing. Someone could have outed them. Who really knows what happened? But after this, people started sharing a list of names. It was about 7 or 8 names. And so I Googled the first name, and I see an article where the LAPD arrested people in a drag racing sting, essentially. Somebody was hitting somebody was hitting a hit and run. The cops went to investigate. They find a bunch of people drag racing, arrest a bunch of them. Well, okay, look at the second list on the list. The list of people they're claiming didn't help this trans person, not even rob them, but didn't help them, is the list from that article. It's not real. It's completely made up. It could be that one of those men was the same and they got their facts crossed there, but somehow the facts got crossed up. And I'm telling you, like probably 20, 30 people I know shared this. And they're younger, liberal, educated people. These are not people who are sitting in their mother's basements who've never been to college, or somebody who is partially. These are people who are very, very, very well educated, who have sometimes multiple graduate degrees from some of the best colleges in the world. And they're blatantly sharing fake news because they didn't take 10 seconds to Google something.
Right. It does seem to be that is a big issue on the I don't know if it's a problem on both sides of the aisles, but I do know that Tim Pool has been talking about how he's been engaging with some people on the left, trying to talk to them about news. These are close friends of his, and he has roots in the Occupy movement, so he is a lefty for most parts, but he's reluctantly, as of now, going to be voting for Trump, he says. But he tries to have discussions with people on the left, and they'll just send him back a meme. Like, it's not news. They don't send an article to rebut. They don't even send him something that's long well thought out. It's just a meme of sorts. And it's like, that's not how to have public discourse about important political topics. What are you doing?
Yeah. Well, I think this has become honestly, I think part of this has to do with the irresponsibility on both major parties, but the Republican Party, not conservatives, but the Republican Party mainstream largely abandoned sticking to facts when it came to issues that they couldn't win on. Global warming is one big example. For many years, when people I'll admit a lot of people have gotten a little bit dramatic, and I don't think we're headed towards, and I don't think, like Greta Thunberg says, in 50 years the world will be brimstone and hell and fire will be raining across the earth.
Right.
But there was a long period of time where sensible people said, hey, maybe we should rein back this pollution. Hey, maybe we should look at carbon emissions. And Republicans turned a blind eye, doing things like bringing snowballs into Congress, all this stuff. And then, and especially when you look at George Bush, he was a fool of a man. And a lot of people our age or slightly older grew up in a time where they're looking at a president as a complete fool, and so there was no desire to engage intellectually with the other side. I don't know.
Right.
I don't think that this. Oh, because because some Republicans did things that were illogical and anti-science, if you want to use that term. I don't think that means that you can just to base yourself to sharing memes and trolling them. But I think that's why it's partly gotten to this point. The Republicans abdicated responsibility of listening to facts and being reasonable, and now the Democrats have done the same thing. And regular people, they've absorbed this. And so when someone disagrees with them, when a conservative disagrees with a liberal, the liberal just says, "Oh, well, F you. I don't have to listen to you because you guys are all bigots." And the conservative will say, "Oh, well, you guys are just oversensitive little babies." And that's why part of why we've gotten to this point. People do not have any interest or impetus to debate with each other because they're convinced that the other side is so stupid it's not worth their time.
All right. So you want to stop there and then we can record the rest of it tomorrow, or you want to keep going?
There was one other minor thing I was going to bring up. It just slipped my mind. It was related to. Oh, I wanted to bring up couple quick things about the DNC that I think we'll get into later next week after the whole thing has ended.
You want to do like a teaser though for some of that
Yeah.
stuff next week?
I'll intro the teaser of what one of my next episodes is going to be about, which is the DNC and whoever's creating these ads for Biden and the left generally, they suck at it. They really suck.
Yeah. Yo,
They're
the Democrats
horrible.
are not the party of cool people anymore.
No, and they used to be the party of artists, musicians,
Not
actors,
anymore, yo.
comedians.
The last night or the night before that video, it's done. They're not that anymore.
The Steven Stills and is that his name? Steven Stills and Billy Porter.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll get into that later, but I actually really thought that was satire when I first saw it.
So
And then
did I.
there was the Late Show put out this ad where they photoshopped the faces of several Democrats onto the Avengers, basically.
Oh, and
And
then
then
Trump is Thanos and he snaps his hand and they all burst away. Have you seen that one?
yeah, so I literally, when I saw this, I said immediately out loud, "Wow, this is a really bad ad," because they don't attack Trump. They all just sort of get ready, and they're looking extra fierce. You know, they throw in a Kamala Harris there, and Peter Buttigieg is supposed to be Spider-Man for some reason. And then it just pans to Trump as Thanos, and then that's it. There's no action. There's nothing. It's just, oh, look, somebody photoshopped faces, and we're the good guys, and he's bad. Well,
It's
Thanos is an
so-
all-powerful being who is a titan. He's higher than a god. He destroyed the universe. He killed half of the people in the universe. So they're comparing Trump to this ultimate evil villain, which is what a lot of supporters kind of tongue-in-cheek call him anyway. And then immediately the Trump people put out, I don't think they created it, but they shared a follow-up ad where Trump's Thanos snaps his finger at Nancy Pelosi and crowd disappear.
Yeah, I think
And
that was a Trump supporter who made
funny.
that. See, this is the thing. It's like the Democrats put out this cringy, memey ad, and then some random Trump supporter just totally flips it on its head and does it 10 times better. They're so outclassed in how to work in the new media space. All of the Democrats' power was in all of their cultural power was in Hollywood and the news media. And both of those things are kind of shut down right now. Hollywood for sure. They're not even putting out movies. And the news media, you got tons of people who are reporting from home and they look like crap because they don't have all the magic from the studio around them. And it shows how much of the Democratic sort of cultural capital was reliant upon this old way of doing media that required, hundreds of people working at a set to get it done. Versus like what we're doing right now, we're just two dudes talking on Skype.
Well, they also
recording it.
Not just Democrats, but largely a lot of this media depended on sort of smoke and mirrors, and a lot of times elevating these fairly mediocre people because they went to the right school or have the right connections. And like when you take away all the whole studio, it's like, oh wow, these people aren't very bright or very quick on their feet. I was watching, who was it? I don't think David Brooks is a dumb man, but David Brooks of the New York Times. he started talking at the end of the DNC, and I couldn't even listen to him. He was like stuttering, like a little shaky. He looked nervous. He looked like a 12-year-old who'd been called up to be the first person in the spelling bee. And then you look at the rest of the people afterwards, they didn't even say anything. They were just opening their mouths and spilling words out. Like one person, he just said something about how the Democrats care too much about the baby boomer vote, and then went on. No explanation, nothing to do with the DNC, but they're not looking too good.
No,
I
and then on
I don't
top
know
of
if we
that,
have
Trump put in that carpet bomb of a ad campaign across YouTube right now, which is that's just a nightmare for them.
Yeah, and I don't know what kind of, maybe we could link the videos onto our website or something, but there were those two videos that came out when Trump was still running, I think. And I
In
think
2016?
I'm almost positive they were when he was still running. One, they Photoshop his face onto the guy from the Matrix, and
Morpheus.
yeah, Morpheus is. I don't know that much about the Matrix, but they shoot the.
He's the one who gives the red pill or blue pill option to Keanu Reeves' character, correct?
I've seen maybe half of the movie once 10 years ago.
Okay, yeah, so it's probably Morpheus that he is probably most likely it's Morpheus.
Basically, shoot the bullets at him, and Trump photoshopped as a Matrix character, dodges them all, and it's funny. Even if you don't like Trump, I don't like Trump. I don't think he's cool. I don't think he's smart. I don't think he's funny. But this is funny. Then they had another ad where, and this outraged people. There's a huge hubbub. They photoshopped his face onto a character from Kingsman: Golden Circle. It's a spy movie, and the spies are like expert fighters. So they Photoshop Trump's face onto this expert fighter who kills like 30 people. And then they Photoshop like CNN, MSNBC, Hillary Clinton, Bernie Sanders, on all the people he's killing. Basically all his enemies. And it does exactly what you want in a political ad. It pisses off your enemies, and your supporters laugh and think it's funny. And they share it to piss off their enemies, who are your supporter, or who are also your enemies.
Yeah.
But yeah. So I think that's what we're gonna work on covering that probably after the DNC is over, so you can get a look at the whole thing. And then I think we're also going to work on. We wanted to look into the field hospital in Queens and the emergency hospital at Javits Center, and how it appears they were horribly mismanaged. So that's another up and coming episode.
Okay, cool.
All right, sounds good.
We're going to talk about a proposition on the California ballot for November. It's California Proposition 16, and it is meant to repeal Proposition 209. It's also known as the Affirmative Action Amendment. So back in 1996, California passed something called Proposition 209, which amended the California state constitution, and which made it so that the state government was prohibited from considering race, sex, or ethnicity, specifically in the areas of public employment, public contracting, and public education. It was language that was modeled off of the language of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It was passed at a time where Republicans had more power in California government. I believe the governor in 1996 was a Republican. It was put forth primarily by a fella named Connerly. That's his last name. What's his name? Ward Connerly. Wardell Anthony Connerly. He's also responsible for getting similar legislation passed in, I think, like 3 or 4 other states across the country. But California was the testing ground in the first place where it passed. And now the Democrats want to repeal this proposition, repeal this amendment to the Constitution. That way they can go back to having preferential treatment that's based off of race, sex, color, ethnicity, or national origin. And I'm just going to read off the beginning part of what will be struck from the Constitution. A lot of it is legalese, but the very first, the A sort of paragraph A states, The state shall not discriminate against or grant preferential treatment to any individual or group on the basis of race, sex, color, ethnicity, or national origin in the operation of public employment, public education, or public contracting. This new Proposition 16 would strike that from the Constitution, thereby making it legal to grant preferential treatment based off of these various identity groups. And I think it's also important to remember that, what was it, maybe 2-3 months back now, the Supreme Court ruled that sex includes issues of sexual preference as well as gender identity. And so the argument here is that in order to fight the discrimination of the past, you need new discrimination, which gives preference to historically marginalized identities. And that's basically the gist of it. I'm not necessarily a great fan of it.
I think one of the major issues going on here is that affirmative action is intended to fix past wrongs. And the idea is that you are going to help people who have been historically discriminated against get into institutions. And it was not meant originally to be a long-term project. It was meant to accomplish a specific goal and then gradually be peeled back. And what you see happen in California and other places is once they peel back affirmative action, the racial makeup of public schools changes quite drastically, right? It goes from being the percentage of Black people and Hispanic students seems to go down. The population of white students seems to stay mostly the same, and the population of Asian students massively spikes. And part of the reason people are upset about the law banning positive discrimination is that they want the demographics of these colleges to look differently. So I think that's an important thing to point out. That this isn't some sort of abstract, academic debate about whether or not affirmative action is helpful or harmful. It seems that a lot of people want to change the demographics of California public schools, and the way that they're doing this is through discriminating based on race.
Right.
And it seems fairly clear that Asian students are going to be discriminated against quite harshly if they're allowed to consider race in college applications.
Yeah, and if you look at the statistics on various UC admissions, you see that before this language was put into the California state constitution, which banned affirmative action, before that, there was white people were kept at around 35% or so, maybe 40%. Black people, African Americans were being admitted at a rate of about 4%, and Hispanic people were somewhere in the low, I think like 7 or 8%. And Asian Americans were also somewhere in like 20 to 30%. With the banning of affirmative action, these numbers shifted. White people's numbers actually went down to something like low 30s to 25%. And Black people's percentage admission rate went down to 2%, which is where it still is. And Hispanic people, their admission rates went down, and Asian Americans went up. So initially, right afterwards, white people received a boost, Asians received a boost, and African Americans and Hispanics fell behind. But as time went on, African Americans stayed about the same at about 2%, but Hispanics have made great gains. They're being admitted at around a rate of 15 to 18%. So their numbers are actually higher than their pre-affirmative action numbers. And Asians continue to dominate the UC and CSU systems, and white people are hovering in the 20s to 30%.
It was pretty interesting that you see Hispanic enrollment numbers go up. And also, the argument is that there's racial discrimination still ongoing, right? That Black students are being discriminated against based on race, to some degree, even if that's not the entire cause of why their numbers are so low, but to some degree, racial animus is holding people back. If racial animus is so bad, you would think that you would see at least some corollary effect in Hispanic students. Maybe people would argue it's not as bad as anti-Black racism, but wouldn't you expect to see some other fallout, that if this was a system that was harmful or off-putting or discriminated against people of color, then it seems likely that the Hispanic numbers would also drop, or at least not, it's about doubled, maybe 2.5 times higher than it was in the 90s.
There's been a drastic increase. You would think it would stay about the same, maybe have minimal movement upwards, but maybe even it would have gone downward if there was a mass problem with a sort of racial prejudice against Hispanic people.
Well, so John McWhorter made this point on the Glenn Lowry show on Blogging Heads TV, and he said that if you've heard this argument before too, there's an argument that tests are discriminatory and some people aren't as good at taking tests. You can buy test results, et cetera, et cetera. If you spent money and time creating free testing programs that helped young, poor Black kids learn how to take tests, and there's another argument about investing in early education, but right now, if you create programs where people can take free SAT prep and free college essay writing programs, that seems like it would be more helpful immediately than this arguments about affirmative action. And you're also expecting colleges to adapt. I'm sure there's some sort of buffer before the law goes in. It might be a year or two or something like that. Maybe not, but you're also putting the onus on these various colleges to suddenly drastically shift all of their whole admission standard. Because if you can consider race, that totally shifts things. And it's not that it's just going to be one small factor, I don't think. I think that when you look at the difference between Asian enrollment in colleges with affirmative action, without, you see that diversity and racial diversity is very important to them, and racial diversity, particularly Black and Hispanic students, is very, very important to them. They're actively recruiting these students. And so this is not just going to be, maybe in 25 years you'll see a small difference. I think very quickly Asian students are going to become discriminated against.
Yeah, and most of the opposition to this is coming from Asian Americans. One of the issues.
One other point about that last part is that I think the reason why you might see Hispanic students doing well and their numbers increasing is because there may be more attention paid to testing within those families. So families are saying, all right, how am I going to get this kid into college? What can we do to get scholarships, this and that? Well, focusing very specifically on testing and essay writing that has helped Asian American groups succeed so well. That may be what you're seeing. They may be copying tactics used by Asian American families, saying, hey, if we make our kids read 100 books and make them write essays every day for 2 months and enroll them in some sort of SAT prep program, because there are free ones, some places. I think that may be why you see the increase in Hispanic students at these colleges.
Right. And I think to talk about the testing specifically, you're right, there are some free programs for test prep, but the ability to do well on the test, some of it comes down to study habits, intelligence, things like that. But one of it is just knowing the test. And so if you've got the money to study the test in a specific way, the standardized test, if you're able to spend $80 or whatever, $150 on some sort of test prep course, you're basically guaranteed, like for the SAT, something like a 30-40 point bump just because you understand the format of the test better. And so there's what's going on.
It's also kind of like an IQ test, where an IQ test on Monday might have a different number than on the next Monday. If you're taking the SAT 4, 5, 6 times, you might just happen to do well. You might have had an extra cup of coffee or something one morning, or apple, and that one day, or some of the questions happen to be about a book you just read. So if you have the money to take it over and over and over again, you're probably going to have one try where you do a lot better than your normal, like what you would normally do. If you put someone on a scatter, it's kind of like a scatter plot. There'll be some outliers and good testing days, and then there might be some underlying ones, but you only have to submit one score. So the colleges aren't looking at these tests and saying, oh, well, you took it 8 times, and on your 6th try you did very well, but the other 7 tries were horrible.
Right. I want to take a look at a couple of quotes from people who are in support of passing Proposition 16. One is State Senator Stephen Bradford from the 35th District. He says, I know about discrimination. I live it every day. We live it in this building, talking about the state legislature. Quit lying to yourself and saying race is not a factor. The bedrock of who we are in this country is based on race. And then I want to read one more from Varsha Sarveshwar, president of the University of California Student Association. Today, colleges can consider whether you're from the suburbs, a city, or a rural area. They can consider what high school you went to. They can consider your family's background. They can look at virtually everything about you, but not race. It makes no sense, and it is unfair that schools can't consider something that is so core to our lived experience. Repealing Prop 209 will not create quotas or caps. These are illegal under a Supreme Court decision and would remain so. The reason I picked these two out particularly, it's cherry picking. There's various statements on this, but the reason why these stuck out to me is because both of these people make an argument that race is fundamental to who they are as a human being. And I think that this is something being pushed by the woke, identity of politics obsessed version of the left wing that keeps placing race as your central identity and making up the bulwark of who you are as a person. And as a race has really just come to mean something like color. And as a brown person, this is just how I would have to identify in this sort of game. I don't think about the brownness of my skin nearly ever. And this idea of being, maybe that's a point of my privilege, but this idea that you have to be constantly obsessed with the pigmentation of your epidermis, it's ridiculous. I understand part of the arguments, but the idea that race is more important than your sex or than your ethnicity, I think that it's bunk, and I think it's part of the reasons why we're having so many issues in the country right now is because we have this race focused perception of the world, and I don't think it's a very useful or helpful lens to look at things or to look at other people.
I think to steelman the left's argument about race, they would say that the vast animus in history, the vast scope and history of racial animus is so bad that failing to actively oppose it is some sort of tacit acceptance or endorsement of it. And part of what they want to do is by focusing on race and looking at race, they want to make up for many, many years of how poorly white Americans treated non-white Americans. And I think the problem in arguing against that argument is that it's a strong argument because there was a lot of really bad racism. But the problem is, how do you fix that? How do you fix the ills and ongoing effects of racism? Focusing on race more does not seem to help very much. And when you look at the people who you're trying to reach, I think that a lot of this stuff is popular among people who are not particularly racist. People who are racist are not going to say, hey, look at the they're not going to watch Blackish on CBS and, clap along. They're not going to see a Black Lives Matter sign and go, oh, that's right. I was wrong all along. And constantly trying to hammer it over someone's head makes them fed up, and you get this sort of reactionary backlash, which I think we partially saw a lot of that in Donald Trump being elected. And there's lots I think part of the reason why Trump got elected is this constant focus on race that pops up over and over again, and has been popping up more and more recently, pushed a lot of people away who otherwise might say, yeah, I do have something like white privilege sometimes. Now these people don't even want to hear the word white privilege because they've been beaten over the head for years now, talking about how privileged they are, how being white is so important, white, 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 black, 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 black. It really does not seem to help, and there's good intentions behind it, but they're quickly paving a road to hell with those.
Right. And I do think that affirmative action had a time and place. And I don't think that we would be where we are today without having some form of affirmative action in the late 60s and early 70s. There's very good evidence to suggest that without the sort of original push of affirmative action, people making the introduction of African Americans and women into the workforce, doing that with some form of affirmative action helped speed along the process. But now it's not. Like, you can have a woman doctor, no one bats an eye about it, right? Or a black doctor for that matter. And all of these people, all the different minority groups of all different sorts have been basically accepted to be able to do any job in America. And now that this has been understood, I don't think continuing the path of affirmative action is going to help things. I think it was good in helping marginalized minorities get into the door and get into these positions
Well, also at a
initially.
different, in
Yeah.
that era, college worked differently, and getting into college worked differently, and going to college meant a different thing.
Right.
And splitting the workplace positive discrimination and college positive discrimination, I think helps too. Because in colleges, if you have a college that is 100% white, I would say it's important to do something, to look into why that's the case. It's very important. So if you look into it and you'll find out, wow, there's a bunch of black people who are applying, and we keep turning them down for various reasons, and we keep turning them down because they go to schools that we don't think are very good. So maybe we're going to reconsider that aspect of admissions policy. You might also find that the admissions counselor is racist. You might have to fire them, something like that, right? But also it might be true, like you're saying, affirmative action. And when it originally started, colleges, not everyone was applying to college. Colleges were a lot of times specifically to go into academia or law, medicine, something like that. And you're talking about a professional class of people. So giving people access to college was directly connected to making more money and getting good jobs, being able to move to a town that was less racist, perhaps even. Today, that path is not so direct. Someone may be going to college because they had a counselor in high school who said, you should go to college. They don't know what they want to do. And when they graduate from a liberal arts school with $80,000 in debt, they don't get a great job. And the other problem is when you look at how people get into college with affirmative action, it's oftentimes students who would have already gone into a college and are getting into a slightly better college because that college wants to look superficially diverse. So Harvard loves wealthy black students and black athletes and other people who help the school in general, right? So if you have a wealthy black student, they're going to pay tuition. They're going to probably have gone to a good school, and they help you look diverse. A poor black student only meets one of those criteria. If he's good at sports or she's good at sports, then that also helps them because they have these vast number of athletic positions they need to fill. And the athletic thing, there's a whole another side to that.
Yeah, that's a
Athletics
whole
are
nother
basically
issue.
affirmative action for white people,
Yeah.
and oftentimes
girls.
white women.
Yeah.
It's oftentimes white women benefit from athletic scholarships in the same way that people at least think that racial minorities do. But what's not happening is that if you're black, that means you're going to get into college. No, what happens a lot of times is poor black people don't apply to college. It costs money, and it's very difficult to go through the process if your parents didn't go to college, or if you don't have a good school where there's a guidance counselor or a teacher or someone who can help walk you through it. There's paperwork. You have to have all these facts, figures, numbers, incomes. It takes a huge
There's a
amount
lot of
time.
bureaucratical stuff that goes into applying for college.
Yeah, and another counter argument about affirmative action that lots of people have made is that if you do affirmative action based on income, you would actually end up helping the people that everyone wants to help. So no one's against helping smart kids who can't get into college get into college. No one's against even some dumb kids going to college who can't get into college. Maybe that'll make them smarter. If the people who are having trouble going to college are poor, rich black people do not have as much difficulty getting into college as poor white people oftentimes. And so if you do income-based affirmative action, you're going to help the same poor black kids and the same poor Hispanic kids that you're trying to help by doing racial affirmative action, and you don't run into all these other problems. And I think that was a very common sense solution to it. This is not going to start. This is not going to help, Chad from the suburbs. Income-based affirmative action is going to help poor people, and I think that will do a lot more to help the people they're trying to help with affirmative action based on race.
Right. I think that things like getting rid of legacy admissions, figuring out a way to, I guess, limit some of the admissions that come in based off of sports. These are all ways to address the same issue. And I think that the class-based affirmative action is probably the most direct way of alleviating some of these problems. I'd like to read something from, so The Atlantic 5 years ago in December of 2015 kind of did this deep dive on affirmative action. There's a number of articles on affirmative action from The Atlantic at that time. Not sure what was really going on in the moment when that happened, but they have a rather long set of letters to the editor that were collected together and published on the Atlantic website underneath something called the Reporter's Notebook, The End of Affirmative Action. And it's really long. I want to read something from one of the very first letters to the editor. And it's called, where is it? Affirmative action seemed to tarnish my achievement. So there's something of a stereotype to this kind of complaint, but that's not really why I'm interested in this. I'm more interested in some of the solutions this student proposes. I'm a black student who went to an Ivy League school for undergrad and now am applying to graduate school. I'm very split about affirmative action. On one hand, I hate it. I am never recognized for any of my accomplishments, never given the respect I feel is due because of affirmative action. When I got into my Ivy League undergrad, and unlike Abigail Fisher, I'm not exactly sure who that is, I was actually in the top 10% of my class when I was applying to college.
She was a white woman who sued the University of Texas system, I think. Pretty sure it was in Texas, over affirmative action, and she claimed that she was discriminated against for being white.
Okay.
And that's why she didn't get in. It actually appears, if you look at the case, in her specific case, I don't think she deserved to get in. But she did end up suing.
Okay. Going on. I took the second hardest course load in my school and had a 2250 SAT and pretty much knocked the verbal section out of the park by getting a cool 800. But the same classmates I went to school with spoke to me and beat in competitions, grumbled behind my back. It was affirmative action. That cut me deeply in a way that I have never forgiven them. I do believe that even without affirmative action, I and many other smart black students would have a good chance of getting into a top school. Instead, affirmative action seemed to tarnish my achievement like a black mark. On the same hand, I do not want to see affirmative action go. Why? Because our college system is not fair. I am at an Ivy. I've met some very dumb people who are legacy admins. Why should you go to school because your father and mother went there? Development admins. My mom and dad gave the school money. Prep students who play obscure sports, polo, squash, sailing, horseback riding, etc., and mediocre sons of professors, famous people, or CEOs. Yet there is no outcry over that. No one cries over precious school spots going to Bobby Goldberg from Andover, who plays squash for Yale, but a black girl whose race was the tipping factor. Cue the cries of unfairness. I think there's a lot to be said about his sort of last critique there about why he doesn't want to see affirmative action being gotten rid of. And that is because there are several different ways in which college admission standards are sort of meddled with beyond looking at academic excellence. And
yeah, and I think his point about sports, I was actually going to bring up a separate Atlantic article. They did a whole deep look into the issue of sports. I believe it was when Harvard was sued and they had to release data on how their admissions process worked, became public. And when a lot of times when people think about sports scholarships, they think about football and basketball. Well, at various schools, football and basketball players do not make up anywhere near the majority of athletes. And because of Title IX, there's also a lot of funding for women's sports. So a program that spends quite a bit of money on a men's football team also has to spend money on women's sports. And so there's a number of teams which need players. Because these teams need players, the schools go out and recruit athletes. And a lot of these sports are, like he said, polo, water polo. I mean, tennis is not necessarily, I mean, I don't know how the barrier of admittance for various sports varies,
Well, what
right?
about like something like
But
horseback riding?
yeah, horseback riding, equestrian, squash, their ultimate frisbee sometimes at schools are now recruiting for. Lacrosse is another one, and baseball. A lot of these sports too require quite a bit of money to get involved in. You need to be on travel teams that cost thousands of dollars a year. It helps to go to various prep schools that have good teams. You have to compete against good players to get better, and equipment for sports like baseball, lacrosse in particular, squash, sports like that requires quite a bit of money. I played lacrosse in high school, and most of our gear was the team owned, and that's also dangerous because you get hit a lot. So most of my gear was just old, team stuff. But even then, you have to buy a lacrosse stick, which is a decent one that you can use. It's about $100. So right away, $100 to get the stick. You need to get shin guards, shorts, socks, all sorts of things. And our team was pretty raggedy. Like other schools, the school just bought them all like matching gloves and stuff like that. We just had like a junk box with various things, and you tried it on and see who fit. Sometimes other kids would give away their stuff, but yeah, I know firsthand that it's very expensive, and the schools that had more money were much, much better at lacrosse. We could beat rich schools at sometimes soccer or football, but we could not beat rich kids at schools at lacrosse. The money itself was a massive barrier. So schools are discriminating against poor people and for rich people, like he says, and this legacy issue is completely absurd. It's absolutely absurd. It's the complete opposite of what America is supposed to be about. And
Yeah,
I
that's
think
some
that
royal bloodline stuff right there. That's some kingly thinking.
yeah, but they're also not particularly too far off. And that if you go to Harvard and you get a good job and you send your kids to a good school, that's probably a pretty good marker for finding smart kids. The problem is you can also do that a lot of other ways, and you run into a problem of inbreeding, basically. You have an echo chamber that emerges, and people are constantly, following the same line. I think it makes, I mean, utilitarianly, or in a utilitarian sense, it would work out, I think, but I don't think it should be allowed. Um, and there's also, scholarships for people whose parents have never gone to college. Or if you're the first person in your generation to go to college, which side point, if your grandparents went to college, but then your parents didn't go to college and you're very poor, you wouldn't qualify for that. So yeah, it seems like there's a lot of ways to discriminate against poor people. And maybe we could just get rid of
That's
all
one
of
of the
that.
critiques coming from people on the right, which I don't know how well founded it is, but I've seen it in a few places, and that is reintroducing affirmative action is going to make it so that African Americans who already have money are going to get admitted into universities at maybe a higher level, or they'll get bumped up to the next tier of university, and it's not actually going to do the work to help the impoverished African American ADOS communities around the state of California, because that kind of work is much more difficult, like we're describing.
Have you read or heard anything about how this would affect or could affect HBCUs? I haven't looked into this at all, but I'm wondering
I
if
don't
this
think
could potentially be a problem down the line.
it could be, but I don't think California doesn't have any.
Okay. But if this trend does catch on, or if there's some sort of federal level edict, yeah, I don't know, and it's a pretty messy situation too, because if you look at most
Oh,
sensible people don't want fewer black students in colleges, and so you have to also figure out a way to fix the existing problems. Besides, I think getting away with race-based affirmative action.
Right, and this is still like happening in several states, where affirmative action is still part of state law, and there's never been any sort of effort to curb it. Um, so I just got a few. When California put in this amendment back in 1996, it was the first state to do so. Since then, Washington in 1998 followed suit, Michigan in 2006, Colorado in 2008, Nebraska in the same year, Arizona 2010, and Oklahoma in 2012. Oh, actually, in Colorado, it was defeated in 2008. Um, so this isn't like anything that is. I think it's still not the norm in most states to have gotten rid of affirmative action. But what's interesting here is that this is a state that had affirmative action, got rid of it, and now they're trying to reintroduce it, which is a very sort of different problem than what we've seen so far across the country.
Yeah, and it also, I think it feeds into the. No, I don't know. I think that we should do a timeline and figure out when the ongoing culture war started. But
I think it can be
it's
pinpointed to a specific date, actually.
a specific date. I
yeah.
don't know. I think that it's a bunch of different things coming together that have been a problem for a while. But this
But
affirmative
when it hit
action
the
debate,
zeitgeist, I give you a date. It's called the Culture War speech. That's what he named it. Pat Buchanan spoke at the Republican National Convention on August 17th, 1992. And
I don't mean going that far back. I mean like maybe in the past 4, 5, 6 years.
okay. I do think this has been a perennial problem since the late 80s to early 90s, and I think it's just shifted. It's kind of shape shifted and morphed in various ways. The culture war was positioned slightly differently in 1992, but I do think it's the continuation of the similar antagonisms. It's
So this
just
may be like a
they've
big
shifted.
skirmish. So if there's an ongoing culture war, the past 4 or 5 years, we've been in a big extended skirmish.
Yeah.
And I think this affirmative action problem feeds both sides of the flame. It feeds the flames on both sides. So both sides are getting something out of it. The Republicans, conservatives can go out and talk about this, and their people get riled up. Leftists, liberals, Democrats go out and talk to their people. They get riled up. They want to do something. And it doesn't. A lot of times, it seems like the loudest people aren't particularly interested in a solution so much as they are being right and having the right stance. You know what I mean? So people aren't like people I totally agree with who make sensible points. I think sometimes the reason that they're saying this is not because they really care. It's because they know that they're going to get likes or votes or something like that.
Right. I have a question for you, and I guess kind of a fun fact. Do you remember who Janet Napolitano was?
Yeah, well, she was the head of the UC system in California, right?
That's what she does now. Do you remember what she did before that?
Wasn't she in the
During the Bush
Homeland
era.
Security or something like that?
Yeah, she was the head of, I think, Homeland Security. If she wasn't the head of Homeland Security, she was the head of the TSA for sure. She was whoever is in charge of all the TSA operations. So I think it was Homeland Security back in the Bush era. And that's, to me, that's just got to be one of the strangest
So she was the
career shifts.
She was the secretary of. So she was the governor of Arizona from 2003 to 2009, and she was secretary of Homeland Security under Obama.
Okay.
Yeah, so she was came in under Obama. I remember there was a lot of people who didn't like what she was doing in California. I don't really remember any of the details at all.
Yeah, she came in at a time when she started her tenure as the president of the UC system. The University of California was doing some pretty not great things, sneaky things, like they were allowing a higher percentage of out-of-state students into the college than they should have been, because you can charge out-of-state students like 3 times the amount of tuition, things like that. So there's been a couple of things, but yeah, it's just very bizarre sort of lateral career move from Secretary of Homeland Security to president of the UC system.
Yeah, I wonder. Yeah, that's maybe we should look into this because that's a pretty interesting leap. Maybe she was just like, yeah, I don't know. I wonder what the skill set at being Secretary of State. Honestly, I would be really interested to see like the government should put out job postings for jobs like the Secretary of State or Secretary of Homeland Security, so we know what kind of
What's
things
the
do they do day
criteria?
to day. Yeah, like if you look at a job posting for like being a waiter, it's going to be like 5 years New York City bar or 5 years New York City waiting experience, quick on your feet, ability to speak Italian, knowledge of wines, stuff like that. What would they post on there?
I have no idea. But I gotta say, she's got a pretty good resume, and I wouldn't be surprised to see her, I don't know, making a bid for something like the White House in a few years. She started off as the Attorney General for Arizona, was governor of Arizona. She has executive experience, head of Homeland Security, head of the UC system. She's got some pretty up there credentials.
So I just
She's
pulled
only
up her.
60. She's only what, 61?
I just pulled up
So
her Wikipedia page, and it's born in 1957,
she's
so
62.
she's 62, and there's one section. It says speculation on other appointments. Apparently, she was repeatedly discussed as a contender for appointment to the U.S. Supreme Court. Some political commentators suggested a possible candidacy in the 2016 election. In September of 2014, when Attorney General Eric Holder announced his intention to step down, there's speculation that Napolitano might be a candidate for the next United States Attorney General. Instead, Loretta Lynch was chosen. Interesting. Yeah,
She's definitely someone for us to keep on our radar.
she's an avid basketball fan.
Hmm.
Well, so there's also a couple other side stories. Well, this is one other side story that's not really related, but I wanted to talk about for a second. Adolf Reed was disinvited from.
To the DNC, right?
No, he was a DSA, Democratic Socialist Association. I'm really bad at remembering what acronyms stand for, but he was supposed to speak in it's a Democratic Socialist of America's New York City chapter, and he was invited to speak, blah blah blah, and he wanted to argue that the left's intense focus on the disproportionate impact of the coronavirus on Black people undermined multiracial organizing, which he sees as a key to health and economic justice. People got mad, blah blah blah, started calling, and then apparently they kind of asked him to step down, and he just agreed not to speak because there's too much stress going on. Cornel West spoken out in his defense. The Hannah Arendt Center at Bard and Roger Berkowitz also wrote an article in his defense. But it's pretty crazy because Adolf Reed is a Black man from New Orleans, and his name is Adolf. He's a junior. His father's name was Adolf also, so that explains the odd name. He's also born, I think, in the 40s, mid 40s. He's 73. But yeah, he is a longtime socialist. He's a professor emeritus at University of Pennsylvania. He's been big figure for a while. He's recently was on Matt Taibbi's podcast. I believe he has a video with Glenn Lowry. He's been doing stuff for like 30, 40 years. And they basically canceled him because they didn't want to hear what he had to say, which I think is pretty cowardly.
Yep, a lot of cowardice going on.
Yeah, and I did send an email to Professor Reed. Don't know if he'll get it or want to be on the show, but I think that would be pretty dope to have him on the show.
Yeah, it would be pretty cool. Okay.
I think there's one other story. Oh, yes, there was one other story I did want to talk about that I can talk about briefly as an intro to a longer look on this again. So Connor Friedersdorf, I'm not sure how to say it. He's a staff writer at The Atlantic. He started looking into a racial incident that happened at the New York City Community Education Council for Manhattan District 2. And the controversy was ignited by a discussion about screening and whether or not you should be able to screen public schools. So like in 4th grade in New York City, you can opt to apply to a screened school, essentially, where you have to take tests and they have various factors that go into getting them. Controversial, blah, blah, blah. This guy was
So basically
arguing,
admittance tests.
yeah. And so you have like specialized middle schools and high schools in New York City. I'm totally against the idea. I think it's blatantly unfair, but not to get too much into it, but a white man was seen holding a black baby, and this ignited an incident. People started calling him racist, blah, blah, blah. They wanted to fire the president of it, and it turns out the baby was his longtime friend's son, and she had not even asked, but just sort of given him the baby to hold for a second
Oh, yeah. I've
on
seen
a
this
Zoom
story.
call.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
Ridiculous.
he goes deep into it, interviews people, and at one point, this woman, there's a Japanese, first-generation Japanese immigrant, and she starts berating people, and this guy, Rockledge, for not having read How to Be Anti-Racist or White Fragility. They literally mention these books, both of them together, and berate people for having not read them. And when asked, like, what's racist about this, they just say, well, you have to do the work and read these books. So yeah, I want to do a deep look into this at some point.
You want to do the work?
Yeah. Well, I haven't read all of the Kendi book. I've read most of it. I've read all of the White Fragility book, which, as I've said before, was arduous and painful and made me physically
Well, that means you've
ill.
done the work. That's why you and I are able to have such great conversations.
Yeah.
There's no
maybe we
other
can
way
get-
a white man and a brown man could talk unless you did the work, Galen.
Yeah.
I'm proud of you.
I'm not proud of myself. I felt
Of course
a little
not. You shouldn't be.
dirty.
That would prove you're racist.
Yeah, it felt like I was forced to watch smut. Yeah, but also Rob and D'Angelo, if you ever want to come on the show, totally welcome. It'd be a
Oh yeah,
grand old
I'd
time.
love to talk to you.
Yes, that would be awesome.
All right. Well, I think that's it for this week.
All right.
Sounds good.
Savior in ourselves will crumble the walls. I know it seems a bit like we came from outer space, but Betty knows I waited for the alien, okay? Chalk it up to destiny, the rest of me is you, like a pretty little rabbit chilling on the moon. I won't break the arcade game before the flash that makes the black heart taste the lash. I won't disclose the future except for what I know. Tell the radio and television to tell the show. I saw the alien, okay. I saw the peace sign, November break of day. I saw the alien, okay, shining in the sky, November break of day. The dead endeavor, happiest rabbit ever, within the cosmic blessing of love and energy. Drums to space, you know this is the place. Our heart and soul has saved the human race. Could it be that we truly know the score? 'Cause my alien friends say we ended the war. A bloody battle, an interstellar fight. Somehow we did it, victory of the light. But I won't break the arcade game before the flash that makes the black heart taste the lash. I won't disclose the future except for what I know. Till the radio and television do tell the show. I saw the alien, okay. I saw the peace sign, remember break of day. I saw the alien, okay. television to tell the show. I saw the alien, okay, okay. I saw the peace sign, November break of day. I saw the alien,